This is Arab Talk on KPOO 89.5 FM in San Francisco. This is Arab Talk with Jess and Jamal. I'm Jess Khan Nab.
And I'm Jamal Dejani.
Jamal, the unfolding catastrophe in Gaza continues to unfold, as well as the attacks on civilian Palestinians in the West Bank and Jerusalem. We're going to be covering all those stories, but more specifically, we're going to be covering a story that is on top of mind for all of us right now as we approach the winter months in Gaza. Displaced Palestinians in Gaza who faced 2 years of genocide are now facing severe cold and flooding because of the winter time without any relief in sight, including protection for them during the winter. There's another very compelling, very disturbing story that just came out, Jamal. This is a group called Al-Majid Europe. It's a shady group using Israeli coordinated channels, and it's quietly flying Palestinians from Gaza to Indonesia and South Africa without the permission of the local governments. It's an extraordinary story. We'll be covering that today. Additionally, we're going to talk about a big story. 3 Israeli footballers raped an American tourist in Tel Aviv recently. It received no coverage here in the United States. We'll be covering that story. But before we get to that, Jamal, you're going to interview a colleague of mine, an extraordinary Palestinian psychiatrist, Dr. Samah Jabr. She's a world-renowned psychiatrist and writer who spent nearly 20 years practicing in the West Bank and in Gaza. She's going to discuss her recent paper she co-authored entitled Torture as a Tool of Domination, the Logic Behind the Use of Torture Against Palestinians. This is on the heels or just in anticipation of the UN Committee Against Torture, the primary international body that is monitoring torture globally and is going to be doing a special conference on torture of Palestinians. It's a very compelling interview, Jamal. And for our listeners, it's also very disturbing.
Yeah, and please be advised that the next segment, this is that you're going to watch and listen to, discusses sexual assault and rape, which may be disturbing to some listeners. We encourage you to listen with care and seek support if needed. We're going to watch the interview, Jess. Starting November 10 through November 28, the UN Committee Against Torture, the primary international body monitoring the implementation of the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment, will review Israel's compliance with the Convention. Multiple reports have been submitted for this review by organizations which are supported by authoritative documentation by the United Nations, Israeli and Palestinian organizations demonstrating systematic abuse of Palestinians and the denial of human dignity since October 7, 2023. The severity and extent of Israeli torture has reached an unprecedented level during the war in Gaza. More than 59 Palestinians have died in prison since October 2023, while others whom Israel released in hostage exchanges were emaciated with severe wounds from beatings, some of them women and children. Yet, in spite of ratifying the Convention Against Torture in 1991, Israel has a history of torturing Palestinians that far precedes October 2023. Joining us on Arab Talk is Dr. Samah Jabr, co-author of a paper entitled Torture as a Tool of Domination, the Logic Behind the Use of Torture Against Palestinians. Dr. Samah Jabr is a world-renowned psychiatrist and writer who has spent over 20 years practicing in the West Bank and Gaza. Welcome to Arab Talk, Dr. Samah.
Pleasure. Thank you for having me.
There has been a surge of Israeli guards torturing and brutalizing Palestinian prisoners since October 2023. One outrageous example being the prisoner who was mass raped and filmed by Israeli prison guards, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's outrage not about the abuse itself, but rather the fact that it was exposed. Is this torture frenzy since 2023 a result of norms in an Israeli society that not only accepts but celebrates this brutality, that there is no longer any taboo?
Well, torture and maltreatment have been there for since the beginning of the occupation. Actually, it's a tool for control and domination. In times of confrontation and resistance, there is an exaggerated use and more institutionalization of torture. In 1987, there was a Landau committee, a committee called Landau Committee, that tried to create regulation for the torture, calling it moderate physical pressure. And in 99, this was outlawed, but in practice, it has never vanished. There has always been reports of torture. What we observed over the past 2 years was an excessive use of torture and maltreatment. It is commonplace when people are politically detained. There has been thousands of people detained from the West Bank and Gaza, with all kinds of people, professionals, students, activists, non-activists, people who expressed their opinion about what's going on, people who happen to be in a certain geography, like in Gaza, people within a certain age group that is considered to be capable of resisting and participating to confrontation. So people were detained arbitrarily, and torture is commonplace. It takes place in the home or the place where they are arrested, in the vehicle of transportation from the place where they are arrested to the interrogation places, during interrogation and after interrogation, even against people with a sentence, or many of them, they don't have a sentence. They are in prison for administrative detention. There is public support and cheering for the videos and the stories that leaked from prison. And it is obvious that there is shamelessness about it. In the past, there were many condemnations and a seemingly legal process where people, of course, they would, in some times when people make complaints, they opened investigations. But now most of the complaints are dismissed. And because people have little hope in and little trust in the system, so they don't complain. How can they complain when the perpetrator is the judge? So this is a big question for people like me who contribute to establishing and writing files, medical and psychological files, that document cases of torture. And then what to do with this documentation? We go through Israeli human rights organizations, and we know that very rarely investigations will be open. Still, we believe that this is an important work for history, for archives, and maybe for the International Court of Justice.
Well, as I mentioned at the beginning, the UN Committee Against Torture is reviewing Israel's compliance with the Convention Against Torture and other cruel, inhumane, or degrading treatment or punishment. In your opinion, in the best possible scenario, what punitive measures could Israel receive?
We are all aware of the impunity of Israel. There is no accountability for the soldiers who do it. In fact, when this video was leaked, the video that you mentioned earlier, there were demonstrations that among Israelis that pushed for the release of the soldiers who were stopped from their work in reaction to the leaks. And there was support, public support for the rape. There was a discussion in the Knesset in support of these people, the perpetrators. And now, as you mentioned, the problem is the leaks, not the act by itself. And we know that this is one story that was leaked, but there are many more. Those of us who encounter the victims and listen to the stories, we know that sexual harassment and sometimes rape uh, are becoming common practice. It's a pattern. It is not an isolated case. Yesterday, there was an important report published by the Palestinian Center for Human Rights. It has chilling accounts and testimonies by people who experienced sexual violence and rape, men and women alike. Very, very heinous crimes were described in their testimonies. So we know that it is being done deliberately, sometimes filmed, in order not only to break the individual who has this experience, but also to instill fear and intimidation in the Palestinian public, to break the will and the capacity of the Palestinian people to express their agency, to voice their opposition to all the policies of the occupation. And it's a very heavy strategy that is being used against the Palestinian community.
You refer to the Landau report of 1987. Can you expand on this a little bit? Also, I mean, historically, we know there are all kinds of forms of torture going way back. And my question is, how far does this go back while Israel politically sanctioning it? Even, I mean, during the first Intifada, when it was a peaceful uprising, the celebrated former prime minister, who was at the time, I think, defense minister, Rabin, ordered the beating and the breaking of the bones of children at the time, and also torturing them when they were imprisoned. So how far does this go back? 1967,
since the beginning
1948?
Of the occupation in 48. Yeah, since the beginning of the occupation. And, military law is created to give a false impression that Israel is a lawful state, and the judgments are used to frame the Palestinians as violators of law, and it creates the conditions to punish them, and torture is often used for revenge, for punishment, as a way to coerce people and impose certain confessions on them. Conviction rate is very, very high among Palestinians, especially among minors. So it goes back to the beginning of the occupation, and we know it has been practiced against the Israeli Arab community in order to impose fear and silence on them. And it's used against every Palestinian over this statistics is old statistics, but before the past 2 years, we know that a minimum of 20% of the Palestinian population experienced political detention. 20%, almost in every home, there is one person who was politically detained, and we know that torture and maltreatment, inhumane treatment, is common practice. And usually it is so common that there is a sense of normalcy. In my clinical work, if people don't come and say, I experienced torture in prison, and even if we ask them directly, they will say no. But if they describe what happened to them from the moment of political detention until the release, there are many episodes of torture, but they don't put it forward because they have witnessed someone who was tortured more brutally than themselves. So there is a sense of normalcy that makes people not talk much about it, or because the describing what happened is so anxiety and shame provoking and people avoid talking about it. It's not easy, and this is a big barrier for us who provide treatment, let alone documentation and reporting on these cases. And the impact is huge on the Palestinian. The psychological impact on the people, on the individuals who experience this, is huge, and it causes psychological scars that stay with the person until the end of their life, and sometimes they go from one generation to another because they are expressed in the attachment style. A person who experienced torture himself has difficulties uh, connecting, attaching to their children in a normal way. Even in their intimate relationships, there will be an impact and weight of this severe form of trauma on the person and his family and the society in general.
Your paper focuses on torture of the Palestinians as a tool of domination of a culture which exacts Palestinian submission and acquiescence to Israel through coercion and pain. Differentiate this system-wide torture from other cases of torture historically, which, while horrible, are not systematic.
So this is systematic. It's widespread, and I think that Israelis are not keen on making it secretive. They allow the leaks because they want the society to observe, because it has an impact beyond prison walls, beyond interrogation centers. They want the Palestinian public to know that severe harm, ever damaging pain, psychological pain, might arrive if people dare to fight against the occupation. I observe the devastating impact on individuals, but also, especially when we talk about minors being exposed to torture or sexual harassment in prison setting, the families have a feeling of guilt because they could not prevent that from happening to their children. So it has a big impact on the family. And when we know, everyone in Palestine now knows that torture and severe forms of torture take place, and it makes the society paralyzed. Like, how can people engage in resistance uh, in the national struggle if they know that their opinion, their activism will be punished so severely? So it is systematic, and it's unfortunately, an effective modality to control and intimidate.
What are prevalent torture practices that embody this psychological drive to subjugate and domineer a group of people? I mean, what do you hear about? What do the former prisoners talk about? What is prevalent? I mean, we hear about waterboarding and beating, and what other? That's the physical, but what is the psychological?
Beating and sleep deprivation have always been there in difficult times, and also suspension, stress positions, suspension. What they call, they use the term shabh in Arabic language. So those are very commonly practiced almost against everybody. Now, in the Landau committee recommendations, there is a small star that says that when there is a situation of a ticking bomb, they can go beyond the usual measures. So, and Israelis often interpret a certain situation like a ticking bomb situation. So they can do anything. Um, uh, Sometimes waterboarding, confining people in very small, solitary confinement is usually used, but sometimes they confine people in very small cages, sexual humiliation, electric shock is being used, and it can be used against the genitals of certain prisoners. The report that I read recently by the Palestinian Center for Human Rights are all about the systematic use of rape, sexual assaults, humiliation, sexual humiliation, particularly. So those are just a few modalities.
Since 1967, since Israel occupied the West Bank, separate processes were established for prisoners accused of a specific crimes and those designated as security risk. Israel uses that word, security risk, a catch-all category for anything under Israeli law. What's the significance of this?
This security risk can be interpreted according to the person in charge. It has there is no fact called security risk. There is an ideology called security risk, and you can put everything. You can use it largely to permit any attack, any. It can be misused. It can be used as a pretext to inflict harm. I don't think that what Israel is doing with our political detainees is being done for security reason. It's being done for revenge and for intimidation, for breaking the will of the individuals who are detained, but also in order um, to to frighten and paralyze the Palestinian society.
Palestinian prisoners have long used hunger strikes to protest Israel's harsh and unlawful detention. In May 2023, Khadr Adnan died following an 87-day hunger strike in protest. During his hunger strike, it was reported that he was subjected to subjected to humiliating and cruel treatment by Israeli authorities up until his last days. Can you briefly talk about his story?
Khadr Adnan was featured in a film, and I was the protagonist of that film. And he spoke in the film about how the Israelis used to put the dirt from their shoes on his mustache, and how they humiliated him, how they used sexual obscenities and filthy language against his family members. And he was in administrative detention many times. I think he passed over 8 years in administrative detention, put together 8 years. And every time he managed to free himself with hunger strike. But in 2023, already Ben-Gvir was in power in his position, and he was responsible for prison administration. And it became clear that there was tightening of the policies against Palestinian political detainees, and he did not receive the necessary medical care that any political detainee on hunger strike should receive, according to medical recommendations, the Malta Declaration, for example, of the World Medical Association. So he was left in his cell rather than in a hospital. He didn't receive the necessary medical aid, and he was left to die. It was a very sad moment. It was in May 23. I do remember that moment, that day, and I remember the reaction of the people. And I have to say that some prominent Israeli journalists, Eddie Cohen, one of them, said that this man wanted to commit suicide. He committed suicide. He wanted to die. Adding a pathological description for his choice to express his resistance and be on hunger strike.
Israel has the dubious distinction of being the only country in the world that systematically prosecutes between 500 and 700 children in military courts each year. I mean, are these children treated differently than the adults? What are they subjected to?
Inhumane conditions. Children are treated with a lot of cruelty. Israel changed the age of responsibility for Palestinian children so as to allow a 12-year-old to be sentenced and pass time in prison. We know of the famous case of Ahmed Manasra, the boy who was arrested from Jerusalem, and he developed a severe mental condition in Israeli prison, and he was in solitary confinement most of the time using the pretext of his medical condition, of his mental health condition. They are not treated as children at all. We have been talking about the policy of unchilding Palestinian kids. So I remember a title from an Israeli newspaper saying when Ahmed Manasra was among two boys who attacked two Israeli boys. All of them were between, the Palestinian boys were 12 and 13, and the Israeli boys were around 14. And the title in the Israeli newspaper was Palestinian terrorists attack Israeli kids. So Palestinians are not seen as kids at all. So they are beaten, they are interrogated, tortured, interrogated without a lawyer. They end up signing papers in Hebrew language that they don't understand. Conviction rate is very, very high among children. Israel uses very heavy sentences, like if you throw a stone, if you are a child and throw a stone, you risk up to 10 years in prison. And if you throw it at a vehicle, you risk up to 20 years in prison. So I think that the impact on children is even much worse, because adolescents and children are at a very critical stage of their development. They don't have sufficient psychological defense mechanisms like adults. They don't have sufficient language to express the pain that they go through. And a traumatic event like detention and torture in this stage, the stage where they form their identity, can interrupt their adolescence, that can interrupt their maturity. So it has a very heavy impact on them. I've been working with children when they leave, when they finish their sentence and get out of political detention. And usually they find it difficult to go back to school after missing a few years from school. And it's difficult for them to learn a career, a vocation, and to find a job. They don't accept the authority of the father or the teacher, because usually they were arrested in the presence of the father or the teacher, who could not prevent that from happening. So I remember writing an article about it, about adolescence interrupted, how this experience of political detention prevents the child, the adolescent, from going back to their childhood, or from continuing their development and maturity into adulthood.
Are we talking about a lifelong trauma? I mean, and also is their trauma curable, or can therapy uh, cure them, or it just gives them a coping mechanism? And what is the most prevalent long-term effect or behavior change that you have observed in children as a result of torture? How do you and other therapists and psychologists try to remedy or counteract this?
Well, we try to provide therapy, psychological support. We try to create groups for people who have a similar experience, like support groups, healing groups. And we try to provide this help and this form of support as soon as possible. It can mitigate some of the traumatic sequelae, psychological sequelae of the traumatic experience. We try, I remember at a certain point, I worked with schools trying to help these children to be reintegrated in the school system. Some organizations like the YMCA in Palestine try to give vocational training for these children, taking into consideration the special difficulties and challenges that they might face. And yet, this is all of what we are doing, and it is not sufficient because many of these children, they have a revolving door relationship with prison. When a child is known to be as an ex-prisoner to the system, if there is any chaotic situation in his region, he will be redetained. He will be arrested again, simply because much of the detention targets people who are identified by the system as risk, not because they do something else. So many of these people experienced political detention several times, and this risk of to be re-arrested impedes the therapeutic process for many.
So, in other words, they can never go back to normal.
Many cannot go back to normal. This is a very harsh experience that changes the prospect for many of these kids.
How does the society receive them? I mean, even here in the United States, if a minor goes into jail and comes out, they're shunned, because he has a criminal record.
Listen, it's not easy. Well, first, the Palestinian society realized that those are not criminals. On the one hand, there is glorification for their sacrifice. On the other hand, the political reality is so cruel to the point that imposes social isolation on these kids. Let me give an example. Some families don't want their kids to get close to these boys because they worry that their kids will be targeted by association. So there is this contradictory feeling. On the one hand, people pay respect and glorify their sacrifices, and on the other hand, there is caution about socializing with them. At the same time, we try to recruit institutional support for them, creating opportunities for treating them. And I have to say that the challenges for an adolescent is different than, like, there are gender disaggregated challenges. For women, it's probably more difficult. Women, when they spend time in prison, I provided the support for certain groups of women, And they told me that the family becomes overprotective and they do the censorship, making sure that they don't write anything, they don't express themselves on social media, they don't participate in any demonstrations. Some ex-detainees complained that it's very difficult for them to find a job because private sector doesn't want to give a job for somebody who has the risk of being redetained, and then they will be obliged to pay the salary when he's detained. And we know that the Palestinian Authority cut the stipend for the prisoners. So many live with financial hardships also. So there is no source for supporting them or their families, and this is an additional difficulty and hardship for people who spend time in prison.
You mentioned, just to clarify, I mean, you mentioned the minors as boys, and then you talk about women, but there are also young girls. I mean, and just in my interpretation, between woman and a girl is kind of being a minor or not under the age of 18. There was the case of Ahed Tamimi, for example, and then other cases. And then again, the question is there a taboo for girls to be formally detained by the Israeli authorities? More of a taboo than, let's say, a boy coming out and celebrated because of being,
I don't think it's a taboo. I don't think it's a taboo. I think that the society doesn't celebrate women ex-prisoners because the society is conservative and they don't want. It's like they consider the imprisonment of women, especially with the ongoing news and reports about sexual harassment and violence. They consider this to be the weak, the soft belly of the Palestinian society. The norms and they worry a lot. And I think that when they don't glorify, it's not because this is a taboo. It is because they don't want. They want to make sure. Families want to make sure that this will not happen again to their daughters. Now, also another thing that I've written about is how in prison, Israeli authorities use gender-specific ways of interrogation. Almost every woman who has a child, who has children, was told during interrogation that she's a bad mother. And otherwise, why would she get involved in activities that bring her to prison, injecting guilt in her, criticizing her motherhood? Many young girls were told that they are not feminine enough. And that's why they get involved in activism that takes them to prison. So on the one hand, there is a lot of gaslighting here, making them believe that they are responsible for their political detention, and playing with the societal gender sensitivities in order to inflict more psychological pressure on these women. So, and also there are, for example, several women told me that they don't receive sanitary pads or toilet paper. And when they are bleeding, they are blackmailed, like, okay, if you kiss the Israeli flag, you will get sanitary pads. So those are very humiliating experiences. And painful. And the conservative psychiatric definition of trauma talks about physical damage or sexual violence, but they don't consider experiences of humiliation and degradation like this as traumatic. But what I see in my daily practice is that the psychological impact of these experiences can be more damaging than beating or physical damage being done to people. So those are just examples of the experiences that people report.
Do you find it more difficult for women or girls to talk about what happened to them in jail versus the boys? Maybe they can confide with you more because you're a woman versus, let's say, a male psychiatrist?
I think even for males, they find it easier. Some of them told me that they find it easier to talk about the experiences of humiliation and shame to a woman. It's easier for them to tell that to a woman therapist than a male therapist. But there are, of course, individual differences, so It's difficult to make a generalization out of these observations.
The focus of your paper is from a psychological perspective in determining what true healing for victims of state-sanctioned torture involves. You say that clinical methods alone are insufficient and that treatment must also involve addressing the injustice and the politics that give rise to the inhumane practices, as well as their acceptance. How do you advocate for victims be treated holistically in a way that will be meaningful and healing for them?
We need to acknowledge that the human rights violations that have been done to these people, and we need to step out of our role as clinicians to advocates. And this requires of us to document these cases, to write professional files that will help in advocacy and redress for these people. This is called a critical human right-based approach to mental health, where our role is not only as a clinician treating symptoms, but also as a clinician who emphasizes the importance of human rights and reports on the violation of human rights and become a voice for these people and help translating their dismissed story into professional reporting be dismissed. And that will be taken into consideration by human rights organizations and international law organizations.
Dr. Samah Jabr, thank you for coming on Arab Talk.
Pleasure. Thank you.
That's the voice in the face of Dr. Samah Jabr. She's a world-renowned psychiatrist, Palestinian psychiatrist and writer who spent over 20 years practicing in the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. She's an extraordinary figure, Jamal. She just published a book. She published this very disturbing article, Torture as a Tool of Domination, the Logic Behind the Use of Torture Against Palestinians. Her interview should be seen by everybody, despite the fact that it's so disturbing. And we see yet another element in the Israeli attempt to dominate, control, and manipulate Palestinians through the use of torture, which, is not only illegal under international law, but is, tantamount to a war crime in the service of what they do. It's a very chilling interview.
That's right, Jess. And our next story, Jess, is as you know, cold temperatures and heavy rainfall are worsening already. Dire conditions for displaced Palestinian families across Gaza, as Israel continues to block the deliveries of tents and shelters and other critical shelter supplies into the besieged territory. And, I've actually watched images and video of the rain with flooded tents, and I watched Palestinians in Gaza attempting to dig trenches around their flimsy tents to keep the water from flooding. Didn't work, and others just left the tents and then went back to the destroyed buildings, the collapsed buildings.
Right.
Even those, even though there is the worry of these buildings collapsing on top of them, the buildings gave them better shelters than the tents, because the water was like coming from the tents, the roof, and from the ground beneath them.
Yeah, Jamal. I mean, I've actually been in Gaza a number of times during the winter months, even under the, in air quotes, best of conditions in Gaza during the wintertime. It's bitter cold, it rains, it floods easily. And this is prior to the devastation and genocide in Gaza. So we can only begin to imagine the impact that this is having on Palestinians right now in Gaza, because the winters are bitter, it rains heavily. And of course, Israel, despite its agreement with the international community and the United States, continues to limit the amount of protective equipment, limiting tents, limiting clothing, limiting food, water, and medicine. It's the same story, Jamal. I mean, we call it a ceasefire, but in reality, Israel continues to commit these crimes against humanity by denying access. And I, for one, want to add another kind of concern that I have, because we know in the wintertime is also a time when viruses kind of take over. There's no vaccinations for Palestinian children and other civilians in Gaza right now. I'm very concerned about the bleakness and the medical consequences of what this winter holds for Palestinians in Gaza, Jamal. It's going to be very devastating.
And the United Nations said, by the way, which we've said that that figure keeps changing, that Israel destroyed more than 198,000 structures across the Gaza Strip. And at the same time, UNRWA is saying that it has enough shelter supplies to help as many as 1.3 million Palestinians, but cannot bring them into Gaza due to the Israeli restrictions. And then you have a whole truckloads of those mobile homes that have been donated by the EU and other countries. They're just there, prevented from entering. I mean, this would solve, not permanently solve, but will alleviate the crisis if Israel allows these in, and they are not allowing these in. And there are, weather reports that it might snow in the next month or so. So the situation, as you've mentioned, I've watched a family, and they said they can't sleep because of all the people around them, surrounding them, coughing, mostly children. So if you talk about the viruses, they're already there. Kids are sick from colds and from the flu. And of course, the elderly might suffer from pneumonia as well.
That's right, Jamal. See, this is part of the story that is not being picked up by the media here, let alone the media globally. People are just kind of lulled into this idea that there's a ceasefire. Yet Israel continues to violate the ceasefire agreements, by denying entry. And, people get sick in the wintertime. But can you imagine Palestinians in Gaza, Jamal, who are getting the flu, who are getting other viruses, especially children and people who are medically compromised, not even having access, let alone to vaccines, but to other medicines like antibiotics that could help them if they have these infections. It's a grave situation. We all anticipate that thousands upon thousands more Palestinians will die in the wintertime, Jamal, because of the lack of support and the denial of access of all this additional, treatments, as well as protective equipment, places to live, eating, food, water, medicine are being denied by Israel, will cause untold number of deaths. It's devastating.
So we have now new reports that a shady group called Al-Majd Europe, using Israeli coordinated channels, is quietly flying Gazans to Indonesia and South Africa, which, by the way, this is part of the plan that Ben Gvir and others were saying that they should, give Palestinians some plane tickets and some money and send them out. And of course, there are families who are very desperate to get out of the hell hole that they are living in. And so they're falling for this trap. But this group basically is very shadowy and shady, I should say, from what we've been reading. They've been involved in flying Gazans to South Africa and other countries in a charter plane carrying approximately 100 to 153 Palestinians who recently arrived to South Africa. They didn't know the destination. Just they won't tell you the destination until you board the plane. And first, it was reported because the plane first landed in Nairobi, Kenya, I guess, for fueling, and it was held on the tarmac for hours due to irregularities because these passengers didn't have passports and paperwork and so forth. And then eventually South Africa, that's the first flight, allowed it to fly in. And then they let them in because of humanitarian reasons. I mean, imagine just showing up there in a plane. And so according to some Palestinians who spoke about it, and they said they used the service, which was advertised on the web for them, and there was coordination for them to leave through the Kerem Shalom to exit Gaza. And then they basically left from Gaza and transited into Kenya. One man said he paid $6,000 to get himself and 2 family members out of Gaza. So there is also the war profiteering from this. And then they have other destinations that this group has been promising to send them to Malaysia, even to Australia and Canada. And they've been using, like as I said, the social media to advertise, for some of the desperate Gazans who just want to get out. And they've been falling for it. They use like a false address in East Jerusalem. That's what they're kind of putting themselves in an address in East Jerusalem, and use AI-generated images for its executives. So you don't know who is exactly behind them, except that the Israelis have a finger in that.
Of course the Israelis have a finger in it. This is part of their plan to depopulate historic Palestine of Palestinians. And as you mentioned in the beginning of this segment, Jamal, Ben Gvir and Smotrich have been talking about this plan of giving and even Trump alluded to this, just give Palestinians in Gaza plane tickets and they'll just leave and go somewhere else. There's a double problem with this. What they're doing is not just illegal, it's fundamentally illegal. But they're preying on the kind of desperate feelings that Palestinians in Gaza have to, support their families, get their families, as you said, out of this desperate situation. What they're also doing, Jamal, and I've been hearing this in the circles that I'm in, they are advertising on social media in the United States to collect money. And the advertisements are things like save Palestinians in Gaza, donate to this organization to help people get out. I mean, it's so incredibly depraved and horrific what they're doing to prey on people who really do care fundamentally about what's happening in Gaza right now. They've raised a lot of money. People don't know where this money is going into. And now there's an uproar because this story is finally breaking. I'm not hearing anything in the mainstream media here about this, Jamal. I haven't heard anything about these illegal flights, but I'm sure this story is going to continue to unfold.
Another story that you won't hear about in the mainstream media, and that's why I put it in. Basically, we wanted to discuss it. You got two Israeli National League players and a former player. They got arrested after a 29-year-old U.S. tourist accused them of rape during her stay in Tel Aviv. And these guys are well known. And according to the police, the tourist reported that she was raped at the beginning of the month at a hotel or hostel in Tel Aviv. And following an intensive investigation by detectives in Israel, she was able to identify the three men from Netanya. They live in Netanya. They were arrested. And there again, two of them are active players, aged 21 and 25, who was a former players. And the suspect said that they maintained that the encounter was consensual, but the complainant firmly denies this claim. And she immediately called her friends. She had friends, and that she gotten raped. And the reason I mentioned this because other stories like this happened in Cyprus by Israeli former IDF soldiers, and of course, our discussion today was about how the Israelis were raping Palestinians in jail. Not to mention that many of them, when they flee the country, they had cases like in Australia where this woman was molesting young children. She fled to Israel. So my problem with all of this, of course, and it's not just to add on what we know what's going on in Israel, is if this was the other way around, like I don't hear Ambassador Huckabee talking about it. I mean, his job is to protect American citizens.
Americans.
He doesn't talk about it. It doesn't talk about when the settlers attacked villages where American citizens got attacked and beaten and killed. And now you have an American tourist who was raped, and it's like a hush-hush kind of like, let's keep it quiet. And the only reason I knew about it is because I read the Israeli media.
Right. And here's the other thing, Jamal. You mentioned, rightly so, that where is Ambassador Huckabee? Where's the State Department in this when an American citizen is being raped by Israeli citizens? Let's also not forget, Jamal, that there is a Palestinian American citizen, a child, in Israeli military detention going on 6 months now, and nothing is coming from Huckabee or the State Department when American citizens are being illegally detained by the Israeli military. So I think both these stories are really big, Jamal. They show that the United States continues to give cover to Israel. They act with impunity against American citizens. They detain them, they rape them, and nothing is done about it. Where is the State Department, Jamal? Where is Ambassador Huckabee? Nowhere to be found.
You've been listening to Arab Talk on KPOO San Francisco 89.5 FM. Go to our website, arabtalkradio.com, to download the latest shows, and we'll talk to you next week.
See you next week.